As a result of the massive offensive operation, the Ukrainian armed forces are on the verge of gaining complete command of the conflict from both the air and the ground. The Zaporizhia front, Kherson, and Crimea are all consistently being targeted by the Ukrainian army as part of this offensive assault. In addition, the Ukrainians are making significant headway both in the Donbas region and along the southern front lines of the conflict in settlements such as Bakhmut, Klissarika, Krasnaya Gora, and Byrkvik. Violent skirmishes are still taking place at this time. The majority of missile and drone attacks are concentrated in Ukraine's coastal regions, in contrast to the eastern front lines, where Ukrainian soldiers typically engage in trench and tank battles in strategically significant coastal regions. The Ukrainian military makes extensive use of missile defense systems that were purchased from the West. This is due to the fact that there is only one opportunity for you to take an offensive action of this kind. As a result, the Ukrainians have a tendency to use precision attacks to destroy the Russian-controlled targets that are located along the shoreline that we are discussing. Utilizing the advanced weapons and missile systems that it has acquired from Western nations and the United States of America is the primary strategy that Kyiv intends to use in order to accomplish its primary objective, which is to construct a connecting corridor in the southern strip of Ukraine to Crimea. Because of this, Western missiles are flying in heavy and consistent presence along the southern battle lines of Ukraine. The most recent illustration of this was seen in Berdyansk, which is located in Ukraine. Anti-tank Javelin missiles manufactured in the United States and supplied by Kyiv made history when they brought down the most reliable military helicopter used by the Russian armed forces. Together, let's investigate every aspect of this crucial attack in further depth on the Berdyansk front in the Zaporizhia Oblast. The Ukrainian 36th Marine Brigade utilized an FJ-48 Javelin that was supplied by the United States. They fired this missile to take out a Russian Ka-52 combat helicopter. This weapon is most commonly employed to take out Russian tanks. This surprise strike operation was carried out by the Ukrainian forces of the 36th Marine Brigade of Ukraine while the Russians were not expecting it. President Vladimir Putin's authority and position have been severely undermined as a result of the most recent loss of a Ka-52 combat helicopter by the Russian army in this region. The Russian official media made a point of highlighting the capabilities of the Ka-52, asserting that the platform was designed to eliminate enemy tanks, armored and unarmored vehicles, troops, propeller vehicles, and other aircraft in any weather condition, both on the front line and at tactical depth. According to Moscow, the Ka-52 was able to effectively maneuver and undertake complex aerobatic operations because of its one-of-a-kind coaxial rotor system and enhanced longitudinal control. Additionally, a lot of emphasis was placed on the fact that this helicopter was equipped with advanced avionics. In point of fact, the circumstance for the Russian forces stationed here is significantly more precarious and dangerous. According to the information that was made public, the dispersed groups of the Ukrainian army prepared a capable defense, mined the approaches, and used heavy artillery to drive the Russian units from the right bank. On the other hand, the Russians are making an effort to retake the territory that they have lost by attacking the positions held by the Ukrainians from the front. However, the Russian military is unable to transport the wounded. There are helicopters belonging to the Ukrainian armed forces operating in the airspace above the Dnipro-Kherson. These helicopters are working on tanks, mortars, barrels, and anything else that can move. The question is, how near to the primary objective did Kyiv's offensive operations bring the Ukrainians, because Kyiv is so intent on reclaiming Crimea as a strategic advantage in this conflict. The Ukrainian army has been carrying out a significant number of offensive operations on the southern front lines. Plans devised by Kyiv appear to be bearing fruit on the front lines in Zaporizhia, Berdyansk, and other southern regions of Ukraine. At this time, the offensive intentions of Kyiv are having an effect not only on the land of Ukraine but also on Russian cities that are located in close proximity to the Crimean Peninsula. You are aware that the Ukrainians not too long ago staged a daring attack close to the peninsula at the Primorsko-Akhtarsk air base in Krasnodar. There was a significant explosion that took place. The explosion had the effect of prompting the Russians to quickly tend to build their defensive fortifications on the Crimean Peninsula, which is located in Ukraine. Losing control of the peninsula is Moscow's primary concern. On the other hand, the Ukrainians appear to have a very firm stance regarding this matter. Therefore, aside from the southern front lines in Crimea, in which other location are the Ukrainians attempting to beat President Putin and his army in order to win this war? As was indicated in the video, the primary objective of the Ukrainians is to emerge victorious from this conflict and regain control of Crimea. However, Kyiv contends that it is necessary to gain the advantage in the conflict in Donbass and that it is not sufficient to simply march through the Crimean Peninsula. Because of this, the Ukrainian counterattack in Donbass and the southern part of Ukraine continues in a vigorous manner from both directions. Tank engagements and trench warfare are the primary focus of the Ukrainian strategic considerations for the eastern front lines. Recent months have seen significant Ukrainian advancement in and around the Bakhmut region. The area around Krusevka is currently being held by Ukrainian soldiers. The government in Kyiv is attempting to hang from this front line all the way to the other front lines in Donetsk. On the other hand, Moscow asserts that Kyiv's offensive action plans are moving forward slowly and that these operations are useless, despite the fact that these plans are being carried out. Ignoring accusations that progress has been slow, the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv remains steadfast in its ambition to free significant swaths of land and bring Russian President Vladimir Putin to the bargaining table. On the other hand, Russian forces are refusing to negotiate and instead are employing artillery, suicide drones, and air power in an attempt to either destroy Ukrainian forces or compel them to retreat. It's possible that Moscow's new strategies will work for the time being, but ultimately, Ukraine will have a significant edge due to the fundamental flaws of the Russian military, such as its inability to generate forces, its low morale, and its lack of access to modern weaponry for all of its forces. Even though Russia has had some success with this strategy in the early stages of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russian troops continue to suffer from substantial deficiencies, particularly overstretched units and a scarcity of artillery ammunition. Despite these challenges, Russia has had some success with this strategy. In spite of everything that's going on, the furious artillery battle between the two armies keeps going without stopping. To put it another way, the Russians are down to their very last round of artillery ammunition, and they are using it to stop the Ukrainians. However, the Russians lost a significant amount of money on this wager. The Ukrainian military asserts that in just the past 4 days, they have been successful in destroying 126 Russian heavy weapons and 26 multiple launch rocket systems. Other types of military ammunition that have been lost include 322 combat attack bomber and transport aircraft, 309 attack and transport helicopters, 4,062 tanks, 4,288 artillery pieces, and 7,717 armored personnel carriers. Infantry fighting vehicles have been lost by the Russian army. In a nutshell, the Western military hardware and missile systems that Ukraine possesses are actually destroying the Russian military. If the current state of the battle for the Russians persists for a given amount of time, the assistance of the West may eventually lead the Ukrainians to victory in the conflict. The reason for this is that the military resources that the Russian army possesses on the territory of Ukraine are getting dangerously close to being depleted. The Russian military deployed more personnel in the Lyman and Kupiansk directions. The Russian army is attempting to advance the war effort. Additionally, a sizable portion of the Russian army's airborne assault forces were positioned in the east. According to Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Hanna Maliar, the situation in the east is challenging. In an effort to seize control from us, the Russian army has bolstered its resources and is aggressively waging an offensive in the directions of Lyman and Kupiansk. It was seen that the Russian army was shelling heavily. The Eastern Front is still seeing intense fighting, he said. Maliar claims that the Russian army continues to have plans to enter the Donetsk and Luhansk republics' boundaries. The Donetsk and Luhansk regions are the sole targets of Russia's primary offensive strategy at the moment. Because of this, Russia concentrated a sizable portion of its forces in the east, especially its air attack soldiers. Despite this, the Ukrainian army keeps moving forward, despite the Russian army's greater might. Although slowly, the Ukrainian defense forces are thwarting the Russian advance, but they are finding it difficult. Russian assaults last day claimed the lives of 5 citizens from Ukraine. Yesterday afternoon, a father and son were killed when Russian artillery attacked the village of Bilopilia in the Sumy area in the community. police. The father worked as a detective. At least one civilian was killed in the Kherson region last night as a result of the Russian bombing and artillery attacks. 2 Ukrainian citizens were murdered in a Russian strike in the vicinity of Volodar in the Donetsk area. Since last night, numerous localities have seen attacks on Russian army missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles, including Kharkiv, Donetsk, Luhansk, Odessa, and Mykolaiv. The Russians' attempts to harm civilians, in general, had a significant effect on other nations and international organizations. The UN charged Moscow with preventing it from sending relief to Russian-controlled areas devastated by the Ka-52 dam collapse. According to reports, 17 residents perished in the floods that resulted from the dam's destruction by Russian forces. In addition to these, the city of Mariupol, which is under Russian control, has a health system that is essentially non-existent and sees an average of more than 400 civilian deaths each week. According to a statement released by the National Center for Resistance, more than 400 people die naturally each week in Mariupol, a city under Russian occupation. The apex of the highest COVID death rate was 2.6 times lower than this. The city's healthcare system was destroyed by the Russian army. The majority of the hospitals have been modified to treat injured Russian servicemen. Information from the area indicates that even the most basic medical care cannot be provided to civilians. However, despite the Russian military's stringent prohibitions and threats of physical assault, medical personnel who do not betray Ukraine attempt to provide care to citizens without Russian passports. Additionally, according to the Human Rights Commissioner for Ukraine, there have been roughly 240 instances in which social services in EU nations have taken children away from families of Ukrainian refugees. These circumstances arise when a woman must send her child abroad with her grandmother or a relative because she must remain in Ukraine to work. The social services police step in and have the authority to remove the child from the family if the grandmother or other relatives do not have a power of attorney to act on their behalf. Moreover, this child is not regarded as a relative under European law. Numerous Ukrainians scattered to the four corners of Europe as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many of these individuals are seeking sanctuary in European nations as refugees, and their circumstances are dire. The fact that Russia continues waging war despite all these humanitarian catastrophes makes Western nations further shun Russia and President Putin. President Putin's frustrations have a severe impact on the military and his surroundings. Yevgeny Prigozhin, sometimes known as Putin's cook and one of Putin's closest pals, is the clearest example of this. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the CEO of the Wagner Group, reported that 32,000 ex-convict fighters from his private military firm have returned home after their contracts expired, precisely when it was most necessary to resist against the Ukrainian offensive. The Wagner Group has now departed from the key battle areas in Bakhmut. The continuation of offensive actions by Ukrainian forces close to Bakhmut has also been confirmed by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. According to Russian sources, Ukrainian soldiers struck Bakhmut's northern and southern edges. Russian casualties were likely at their greatest level since the height of the combat in Bakhmut last March, according to UK intelligence. It was also asserted that the Ukrainian army had moved up to a kilometer close to Avdiivka in Donetsk, in addition to Bakhmut. In the south of Ukraine, Ukrainian forces had retaken the village of Ka-52, according to a statement from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. But conditions on the Eastern Front remained challenging. Since the counteroffensive started, the government reported that 8 settlements have been freed and 113 kilometers squared of land have been reclaimed, although it is asserted that Ukrainian forces liberated Ka-52. This assertion is yet not conclusively proven. If the allegation is true, 8 or 9 further villages will have been freed as a result of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Officials from the Russian military disputed that Ka-52 was in Ukrainian hands. However, other Russian military bloggers pointed out that their troops had left the region. Officials from Ukraine maintain their practice of refraining from commenting on operational issues. Additionally, Ukrainian soldiers engaged in offensive operations in the western Zaporizhia region to the southwest and southeast of Orikhiv, near Robotino. There was fierce fighting, and close to Rakov, a Russian ammo dump was destroyed. The settlement of Ka-52 in the western Zaporizhia region appears to have been captured by Ukrainian forces, according to the Russian-appointed governor. Explosions possibly related to back-of-the-line action occurred in Russian-controlled Zaporizhia. An ammo stockpile, a Bryansk military hospital, and a Belgorod residence, all of which were destroyed by Ukrainian forces. Russian forces destroyed 4 companies and 77 military vehicles in this area throughout the course of the previous day, according to Brigadier General Alexander Tarnavsky, commander of the Tavria Group of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, which is responsible for southern Ukraine. 2 Russian Ka-52 attack helicopters and 12 unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, including one that belonged to Ukrainian Marines stationed near the Zaporizhzhia-Donetsk border, were destroyed, according to Ukrainian military officials. Additionally, UK intelligence said that Ukrainian forces are still conducting offensive operations at the administrative boundary between Velika Novosilka and these 2 regions in the south, southwest, and south. As for the state of affairs in other regions of Ukraine, following Vladimir Putin's allegation that 5 Patriot missile systems were destroyed close to Kiev, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky disputed that Russia had destroyed any Patriot missile systems. Nearly all of the Russian army's surface and drone attacks on Kiev's capital in the previous day were thwarted, according to the Ministry of Defense. Ukrainian forces advanced up to 2 kilometers on a number of fronts in the south of the country and took control of a key hill close to the Burkovsk Reservoir. On the other hand, Russian officials stated that in the last 4 weeks of fighting, the Russian army has lost 1 general, 5 colonels, and 4 lieutenant colonels. Western researchers report that there are now 251 high-ranking officers known to have perished during the Ukraine war, even though the Ukrainian counterattack has resulted in a quick advance. The Russian positions are becoming more difficult to breach as you go deeper inside the front. Additionally, some of the Russian troops' attack attempts are succeeding. The Ukrainian army is finding it challenging to fend off Russian attacks on civilian areas, particularly as long as those attacks continue. No matter who they are, civilians are the ones who suffer the most from the battle. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine in Eastern Europe is a violent and startling phenomenon that had not been seen in a very long time in the dusty pages of World War history. Perhaps 190,000 victims have been laid to rest so far, with Bakhmut being the most important front line in this conflict. Russian repression and frequent attacks persisted in the Azov industrial zone and the Bakhmut central front line until a few weeks ago. However, the most recent situation in this city, which has evolved into a battleground and a hotbed of conflict, has abruptly shifted this week. According to recently released maps, Ukrainian forces conducted a counterattack southwest of Bakhmut and reclaimed lost positions south of Ivanovsky, which is roughly 7 kilometers southwest of Bakhmut. Following Ivanovsky, crucial offensive operations were conducted a few days ago, enabling Ukrainian forces to retake location northwest of Bakhmut along the Kromov Highway. You are given the most accurate knowledge over all by divine justice to give you the information that is most recent and accurate. We work around the clock, so please subscribe to our channel to stay updated. By clicking the Super Thanks button below, you can help us. The Russians' inability to provide enough military assistance to the city of Bakhmut from Kromov in the northwest and Ivanovsky in the southwest was the main reason that Ukraine was able to retake these locations, because the majority of the Kromov roadway and the trench lines in the wooded areas of Ivanovsky were already under the control of Ukrainian forces prior to the recapture of positions in Bakhmut from the Russians. In other words, taking back control of the connecting roads that provided logistical support allowed Ukraine to retake Bakhmut. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, persisted in making crucial decisions in an effort to maintain the edge they held in Bakhmut to largely control the deepest chasm. Ukraine started sending reinforcements to the damaged eastern city of Bakhmut after the Russians lost control of the city's positions. This cost both sides enormous losses and progressively tightened their hold on the Russian forces. The Ukrainian government made significant declarations in this regard, and the readiness of the Ukrainian troops was affirmed. Hanna Maliar, the Deputy Defense Minister for Ukraine, announced in a statement that her country has begun sending fresh fighters to Bakhmut, the site of the longest fighting of the conflict. Maliar did not, however, provide a precise breakdown of the number of Ukrainian soldiers dispatched to the Bakhmut front line. The fresh forces may be employed to dig up and try to hold the region, killing as many Russian soldiers as possible in recurrent fruitless attacks on Ukrainian positions. Therefore, Russian forces cannot be switched to other battles, or additional Ukrainian forces might be stationed there to back logistically Kiev's long-rumored retreat from Bakhmut. Yes, the Ukrainian army may have a significant edge in Bakhmut with more military support. However, if the Ukrainian forces place their additional armed forces in Bakhmut, it might not matter much without the military and financial support of the West and the US. Zelensky claimed that Western-provided weapons, ammunition, and training are crucial for his country's ability to maintain its opposition in this area. Zelensky cautioned, however, that Ukraine might lose the conflict without additional military assistance. According to reports, the Ukrainian armed forces currently have up to 700,000 personnel serving at the front. On the other hand, the Russian army in Ukraine may number up to 300,000. Although Ukraine has a numerical edge, it is insufficient as of right now. The Ukrainian armed forces must send a sizable contingent of soldiers across the Belarusian border to defend their nation's northwest. The Western Corridor, through which NATO supplies and weapons flow from Poland, is the lifeline for the entire Ukrainian community and army. The struggle for Ukraine may face major difficulties if this route is closed. Kiev must construct a robust defense there because Russian troops stationed in Belarus have the ability to launch an unexpected offensive to the south. Zelensky should also establish a robust manned defensive border in the border regions of Sumy and Kharkiv to fend off fresh Russian assaults to defend Kiev. Several troops were therefore sent to these crucial border lines. A front line of nearly 1,000 kilometers in length is currently absorbing the majority of all Ukrainian forces and supplies, and three main directions are engaged in continuous defensive combat with Russian forces: Svatov-Kremena in the northeast, Bakhmut-Donbass in the centreast, and Davdiivka in the south. Around 80,000 Ukrainian soldiers are stationed in a safe zone in central Ukraine. They are said to be well-rested, outfitted with primarily NATO-supplied equipment, and receiving some training from NATO nations. In fact, in terms of morale, motivation, determination, and discipline, Ukrainian soldiers are generally in a considerably better position than Russian soldiers. As a result, it is anticipated that the Ukrainian forces will launch significant assaults on the Russians, particularly during the springtime. The Ukrainian forces' spring attack may be able to pierce the Russian defenses, potentially driving a wide wedge into them in the direction of Melitopol by destroying the land bridge to Crimea. The Russian supply lines are intended to be cut in half. In addition, achieving this objective would imprison a sizable number of Russian troops in the southern region between Melitopol and Kherson. While the current situation may appear amazing and advantageous for Kiev, few pundits are predicting what the battle will look like moving forward. Additionally, Russia still has at least 100,000 soldiers who have not yet been sent to the front lines, and it plans to raise hundreds of thousands more before the year is up. The Ukrainian army will have exhausted its offensive capabilities and will only have a limited operational reserve and territorial border troops for future operations if it successfully breaches the Russian lines to take Melitopol. In addition, if Ukrainian forces are forced back to Melitopol, Putin might decide to impose martial law and complete mobilization to ultimately help his army without having to wait for 400,000 volunteers. However, there is currently nothing to worry about for Ukrainians. We shouldn't pay attention to the fact that U.S. Western funding is still being provided to the Ukrainian army because it appears doubtful that the Russians will tolerate a decision like the second mobilization again. Nothing in life is guaranteed, but it is theoretically possible, at least, that Ukraine could mount a highly successful spring or summer offensive with help from the West and drive Russian soldiers back to the West. Ukrainian forces are actively attacking occupation zones all over the country, from Crimea to Bakhmut. They do not let the Russians breathe. The Ukrainian armed forces catch the invading troops at their most vulnerable moments, mostly with the help of HIMARS, and advance through their positions. At the same time, the Russians are constantly losing their important commanders. Today was also a sad day for the Russians as the Russian public reported that the Russian military commissar from Moscow, Mikhail Lukin, died in the Donbass. The occupation unit commander was being pursued by Ukrainian fighters who captured the commander's careless moments. The Ukrainian warriors did not miss the opportunity. The military commander died at 3 a.m. today while invading Russia, leaving Putin with a severe shortage of troops and equipment. The news of these losses, one after another, puts him even more in a deadlock. A rocket was launched in Kramatorsk by the invaders the other day, resulting in the loss of 12 civilian lives. The Ukrainian Defense Forces faced death but retaliated by destroying the Russian S-400 Triumph anti-aircraft missile system with the help of HIMARS. According to the Ukrainian military, this is the same S-400 that fired a rocket at a pizzeria in Kramatorsk the other day, killing 12 people, including 3 children. The reports on the incident stated that the defense forces took revenge on the invaders for bombing Kramatorsk. As we know, last week was very active for Crimea. There are very important updates from Crimea today. Ukrainian and Russian forces exchanged a series of massive and devastating missile strikes after a successful attack on the Kerch Bridge. President Putin announced that he was discussing possible retaliation options with the High Command. The Ukrainian command understood that this meant only one thing: a massive drone and missile strike. The main target of the Russian attack was the port in Odessa. The Russian Air Force launched several waves of drones to exhaust the Ukrainian air defense, and based on footage of the successful interception of unmanned aerial vehicles by the Ukrainian air defense over Odessa, this tactic worked. Then the Russians filled the airspace with rockets, almost all heading for Odessa. In Crimea, locals filmed the launch of 16-caliber cruise missiles from Kazanka Bay in Sevastopol. It was reported that at least 8 strategic Tu-22 bombers launched 15 missiles of various types. The greatest destruction took place at the ports in Odessa. The strike aimed to destroy all necessary infrastructure to load cargo, including grain terminals. In fact, the grain terminals took the biggest hit as it symbolized a withdrawal from the grain deal. Russian missiles rendered the entire port unusable, and the invading troops destroyed 60,000 tons of grain. Later, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that the grain agreement had officially ended, and ships passing through the region would be considered military targets. Furthermore, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that ships bearing flags of countries passing through this area would be considered hostile states entering the war. President Putin found himself cornered and unsure of what to do. The Russians managed to target the main ports in Odessa city, as well as the secondary ports in the Odessa and Mykolaiv regions. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that several industrial objects were hit. Judging by the images, one was an oil depot and the other a small ammunition depot. Unfortunately, some missiles hit residential areas, including a shopping mall in Odessa. In response, Ukrainian forces launched their own attacks. The first target was Melitopol, and local residents reported hearing at least 5 explosions on the outskirts of the city. The Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol confirmed that the Ukrainians hit the Russian military bases. Shortly after, explosions took place in Mikhailivka, a fortification to the west of Tokmak. The Ukrainians also struck the Russian base in Skadovsk on the Black Sea coast. All 3 attacks were carried out by HIMARS, with Ukrainian forces primarily targeting personnel concentration areas. The Ukrainians also carried out numerous HIMARS attacks in the east. Local residents of Yasinuvata reported hearing multiple explosions, followed by secondary explosions. Later, the Ukrainians successfully destroyed an ammunition depot. The second pack of HIMARS rockets targeted Russian military objects in Donetsk. There was an explosion at the Russian military base on the outskirts of the city, but the most devastating strike was carried out in Crimea. Here, the Russian forces possessed a huge military zone that was even larger than some of the surrounding villages. The site was also located on one of the main supply routes. Ukrainian fighters hit the Russian base with 3 ballistic missiles. The missiles hit the ammunition depot. This caused a massive explosion that could be heard more than 30 kilometers away. Secondary explosions, which did not allow the fire to be extinguished, continued throughout the day because the fire was so large. Local authorities closed the highway. Then the authorities began to evacuate residents from the surrounding villages. It has been reported that at least 5 villages are considered to be in the danger zone. In addition to all these, Ukrainian fighters came to the fore with the new HIMARS attack. Ukrainian soldiers defeated a column of Russian equipment in Zaporizhia. The blow was dealt to a key area of the front for a breakthrough. The attacks on the occupying column were carried out with the help of HIMARS. Ukrainian troops attacked a convoy of Russian invaders a few weeks ago. The invading troops are grieving the loss of another equipment convoy. Again, Ukrainian journalist Denis Kazansky noted that after all the stories of 2022, he thought that they had already stopped acting in such columns while an oversized convoy of Russian military equipment was traveling through a field. Ukrainian troops deliberately attacked this convoy with HIMARS. After the attack, The convoy was torn into pieces. This was a very bad blow for the Russian invaders in some areas of the Zaporizhia direction. The appearance of the Marine Corps, of the elite of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, was noted. The Russians have big problems with the Zaporizhia aspect here. Convicts conscripted in some areas began to be converted into professional Kursk sailors. This information was announced by a soldier codenamed Osman from the 24th Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Such activities were recorded, including in the area of the village of Robotino, where the Ukrainian army actively broke through the Russian defenses. According to Osman, the Russians are forced to take such a measure because of the great losses. Meanwhile, the Russian Federation is forced to expand its reserves to hold the southern front. The climax of the war comes. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that no one has the right to destroy the food security of any nation. After that, President Zelensky added, "There is an opportunity for the world to show Russia that it does not allow blackmail." President Zelensky spoke of the need to protect himself from the Russian madness after Moscow withdrew from the Black Sea grain deal the other day. President Zelensky added that grain exports from Ukrainian ports should continue with or without Russian participation. Officials stated that Ukraine's exports provide food security for 400 million people. Because of this, President Zelensky was outraged by Russia's arbitrary holding of such a vital supply ransom. The Ukrainian leader stated that, together with the United Nations, which mediated the first agreement with Russia and Turkey, Ukraine could continue the operation of the food corridor and the control of the ships jointly.